So excited for today's robust conversation with three amazing experts in this policy issue area. I'd like to first establish how today's session will go. So we'll begin with introductory remarks from our three speakers, and then our session is going to become a panel conversation that explores the unique specializations and contributions of each of our speakers in this field. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function. We have disabled the chat function, and Shagun and I will do our best to incorporate them into our follow-up questions as the conversation unfolds. Today, we are joined by three esteemed voices in the field of engaging men and boys in gender equality. First, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Sandra Whitworth, Professor of Political Science and appointee to the graduate faculty in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Whitworth did her PhD at Carleton University in political science, and her first book, Feminism and International Relations, was published in 1994. That book was translated into Japanese and was published by Fujiwara Shoten Press in 2000. In 2004, she published a book entitled Men, Militarism, and UN Peacekeeping, a Gendered Analysis. She also adapted Joshua Goldstein's textbook, International Relations, for use in Canadian university and college classrooms. She's written various articles and book chapters on issues like gender and Canadian foreign policy and human rights, and was invited to produce the 2002 United Nations Secretary General study, Women, Peace, and Security. That study won one of the American Library Association's Global Politics, Gender, and International Relations and graduate courses in International Relations Theory. She recently completed a 3-year term as Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and previously served for 6 years as the home-based editor for the International Feminist Journal of Politics. We are also so excited to welcome Dr. Gary Barker, a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities. Dr. Barker is the CEO and founder of Promundo, which has worked for 20 years in more than 40 countries. Beginning in low-income areas of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Promundo's approaches have been incorporated into ministries of health and education around the world. Promundo is a global consortium with members in Brazil, the US, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Portugal. Dr. Barker is co-founder of MenCare, a global campaign working in 45 countries to promote men's involvement as caregivers, and co-founder of MenEngage, a global alliance of more than 700 NGOs. He co-created and leads the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, the largest ever survey of men's attitudes and behaviors related to violence, fatherhood, and gender equality. He is also co-author of the 2015 and 2017 State of the World's Fathers reports. Dr. Barker has advised the UN, the World Bank, numerous national governments, and key international foundations and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality. In 2017, he was named by Apolitical as one of the 20 most influential people in gender policy around the world. He's an Ashaka Fellow and received the Voices of Solidarity Award from Vital Voices for his work to engage men for gender equality. Dr. Barker also holds a PhD in developmental psychology. Finally, we are so delighted to welcome Laxman Belbase, Global Co-Director of MenEngage. Laxman is a social worker and gender justice activist with a Master of Science degree and more than 17 years of experience in program development, implementation, and advocacy in the field of gender equality, child rights, and social justice at the national, regional, and global levels. Prior to joining MenEngage, Laxman worked for Save the Children Sweden for 7 years as a global gender and health advisor based in Stockholm and represented Save the Children on the MenEngage Global Governance Board. Laxman is a founding core group member of MenEngage Alliance in Nepal and has contributed to the strengthening of the alliance in various capacities at national, regional, and global levels, including by coordinating MenEngage Alliance in South Asia. Having worked with national, regional, and global organizations, Laxman brings his multicultural experiences to the areas of gender equality, child protection, violence prevention, engaging men and boys and men for social justice, fatherhood, sexual and reproductive health and rights, comprehensive sexuality education, and human rights advocacy across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. I'd like to begin our workshop by turning over to our speakers for their opening remarks. In the spirit of starting with feminist voice as a matter of principle, we'd love to begin with Dr. Sandra Whitworth. So Sandra, without further ado, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone involved in organizing this fantastic event for inviting me here. I'm going to turn my stopwatch on so I don't go too over time. I thought I'd open with just some analytical touchstones that I've relied on in my work to illustrate the ways in which I've thought about engaging men and boys. In the work that I've done and the work that matters to me, gender is a social relation. It's a relation of power that is not fixed. It is linked to the material conditions of people's lives, the ideas they hold about themselves and others, and the institutions that they build. There's a number of terms that I've just used that I want to signal I mean in very expansive ways. By material conditions, I mean not just the political economy that we find ourselves in, but race, class, sexuality, religion, geography. Material conditions inform all the ways in which we understand gender. By institutions, I mean institutions that are both small and large, that are both local and global. So I mean the family, I mean the state, I mean the United Nations. So I mean by these very, very expansive locations in which we see how gender operates. By ideas, I mean the many ideas we might have about ourselves in whatever spaces and locations we occupy. It can include the ideas we have about what it is to be a man, or what it is to be a woman, or what it is to be a soldier, or what it is to be a professor, or what it is to be a citizen. So ideas too are expansive. There's nothing about gender that is fixed. These social relations are cross-cutting power relations that shift and move across time and across place. It's important to me that the way we study gender does not attempt to fix it as one thing. But I will tell you, as researchers, this makes it very challenging to study gender. How do we know what to look at in any particular location or any particular historical moment? If we think of gender as these cross-cutting power relations, how much attention do we give to sexuality or class or race or religion or geographic location? The unfortunate thing I'm here to tell those of you who are pursuing new work in this area is I don't have a formula for you. I don't have an easy fix that you can plug things in. We will always include religion at 16%, race at 33%, class at 17%. There is no formula to this. And it does require detailed, localized work to understand how gender operates in different time, place, and location. It's really hard to know, where do you stop? Where do you stop asking questions? Are you ever certain your work is complete? Sadly, probably not, because there's almost always something that you may have missed. So I think, I want to say, one, it's an expansive concept, and you have to be open to hearing the ways in which you've missed important elements of how gender operates. I think it's a lot less common now than when I started working that we encounter people who think gender is synonymous with women, but we still do. I'm a feminist. I am committed to using gender analyses to uncover the ways in which inequalities impact women. But at the same time, I have also always tried to be attentive to the way in which gender impacts men and boys. I can't help but look at this, since in my mind, gender is a relational category. It necessarily involves men and boys. And power, while we know that in many locations, many men enjoy privileges and enjoy power, the fact is power operates in subtle, cross-cutting ways. And men are sometimes disadvantaged by virtue of how they inhabit their masculinity, or where they are men, or how their differential relations of power are interpreted around them. Some of my early work, I looked at the International Labor Organization, and I looked at the ways in which, and I'm stealing one of the prompt questions from the organizers, sorry. But I looked at the ways in which workers, male workers were the default worker for the ILO when they established protective legislation for workers. On the one hand, this advantaged men. They were deemed as importantly they were deemed as the ones that needed to be employed. And so when protective legislation came into effect, when the ILO promoted protective legislation, it sought to reconcile protective efforts with the priority of employing men. Women were viewed primarily as the bearers and carers of children. So protective legislation tended to focus on the ways in which hazardous work conditions might impact their capacity to be bearers or carers of children. This impacted men and women in different ways. Men, by virtue of being the default worker category, were largely guaranteed work. Women, by virtue of being the default carer and bearers of children, were removed from hazardous work situations. On the one hand, that protects them, but it also leaves men who are not deemed as importantly involved in either the bearing or caring of children. It leaves men exposed to hazards that affect them just as much as it would have female workers. So the power relations here cross-cut both ways. Default is a privileged position, but it's also a position that has costs. Now, in terms of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, I think the kinds of assumptions that circulate around both women and men, and many of you listening to this may already be really aware of some of the ways in which these work. Men are the default category combatant. And that's true whether or not they are actually combatants. This may mean that they are subjected to and subjected to greater risks and violence by virtue of the assumption that they are combatants. Women are often assumed to be not combatants. This means that, for example, in early efforts at demobilization, disarmament, and I've lost my R, not rehabilitation, but someone will correct me later. In early DDR efforts, women were ignored because it was assumed they couldn't possibly have been combatants. So they weren't eligible for financial incentives to give up their weapons or educational opportunities. Women, on the other hand, were considered more authentic when they mobilized around peace. A woman in a peace march was not taking the same type of risk that a man might take. A man's interest in peace marches might be considered suspect, again, because their primary identity was combatant. On the other hand, the assumption that women were not combatants meant they weren't considered very reliable at the peace table. Only the people who had been combatants were appropriate to appear there. So I think these ways in which power operates, the assumptions that are associated with women and men in these brief examples, can impact women and men in different ways. In terms of engaging men and boys, for me, the fundamental is that gender always includes considering how differential relations of power are impacting both women and girls and men and boys. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for those fantastic remarks. We'll be sure to explore later in the panel section of our workshop what it means to have men as the default and women as the gendered, and also the idea of gender always as relational. You cannot have something that is feminine without something that is masculine at the same time. They exist in the same space. So thank you so much again, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Gary Barker for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Sandra, for your comments. I will take off from there. First off, I think it is important to frame a conversation around engaging men by saying very clearly that engaging men as a piece of whether it's women, peace, and security or gender justice and gender equality work is a means to an end. And I think we often get stuck in the kind of what is the black box of really good programming, and look at who's at the table, how many do we include, if it's group education, how many sessions do we use, if we're doing allyship work, let's do another seminar where we call out male leaders to come and say we support gender equality. That's not entirely what we mean. Those are good things, and of course, getting good programming right matters a huge amount. how we bring men to the table, how we bring men and boys to the table is important. But I think it is important to affirm that the Engaging Men field sits within a field of talking about gender justice and gender equality. And we need to break out of that superficial notion of male champions. We invite a couple of men to come and say, we should have women at the table and men to cheer on, rather than to say, this is a broader, deeper question and conversation around patriarchy and around structures. Promundo's work has come out of, the first 10 years of our work was really getting good programming at the community level, trying to figure out how to do it, have it be participatory, have it be gender relational, engaging women and men in that process. These more recent 10 years have been thinking about what are the structures that influence how men and women interact, what happens at the household level. We started the International Men and Gender Equality Survey in 2008 because there wasn't a lot of good gendered household comparable data on men that we could look at. The demographic and health survey is probably the one that you could say, at least in the global South, you had lots of data, basically didn't measure women's lives very much, and it hardly measured men's lives in gendered ways either. Images has been a nearly 50 country survey to look at what is it that's in the, what do we know about men's support of gender equality or resistance to it? There's certainly not enough time in 5 minutes to go into that. But to say so much of the outcomes in terms of men's practices are driven by the structural realities around them. Access to income or lack thereof, whether their female partner works outside the home, whether they moved from a rural setting to an urban setting where they were exposed to different norms around gender. Certainly individual men need to be held accountable, but it's clear to us as we look at what programming needs to become, we've got to think about those structural influences. So there the question becomes, what does good scaling up, or I even prefer to think about it as scaling in. I think in the development space and often in women, peace and security space, we'll say, let's take a kind of jewel box program and let's see if we can amplify it times 10, as opposed to say, what are the structures and institutions where we need to embed this work? I'll share with you just a couple of examples where we've tried to do that and where I think we've seen a little success. And I think it's important to say success defined by listening to women in particular about changes they perceived in the men in their lives. One example, we've been partnering with Brazil's Ministry of Health for now more than 10 years on creating a men's health unit and protocol within the Ministry of Health to work through the 4,000 primary health clinics in Brazil. In 2017, the ministry itself, taking into account building a men's prenatal platform to engage men to be present in prenatal visits and birth if the woman wants him present. It is now rolled out at a national level. 3/4 of women, and I think it's important to say the reference of who's saying their success or not has been women. 3/4 of women say their male partner was present in a positive way during a prenatal visit. 2/3 of those cases, the man was also present at birth at her choice. That, compared to 15 years ago in Brazil, is a revolution when about 10% of men were present during birth, mostly middle-class men who had access to private facilities. So I give that as one example for how to build it into a public health system that's responsible for the health of about 60% of a country's population, Brazil being more than 200 million. Another example has been our partnership with the Ministry of Health in Rwanda to build an evidence-based parent training program with an emphasis on engaging men, violence prevention and men's participation at the household level being the two most salient indicators. A 4-year randomized controlled trial study, we found 4 years later, impact still holds about 40% less violence in the intervention group reported by women. Increased participation by men in hands-on caregiving, also reported by women. Men's increased participation in prenatal visits reported by women. As a result of that, we're working with the ministry to take it to scale, first at one district level, but then the ministry plans to make it perhaps one of the first global South countries to have a nationally supported and mandated parent training program with father involvement. A third example I would say was working with the Republic of Georgia and UNFPA. Small country able to do kind of media saturation with messages around men's participation in care work. And we did a full national survey in 2014 and again in 2019. And 5 years later, found significant changes in norms by both women and men about who does the caregiving. That said, there was very little evidence that it actually changed who did caregiving at home. So again, showing because we didn't do much changing of the structural. So you can make a lot of noise around the norm part of it, but the challenge of how do you change what really happens as lived experiences in the household is certainly a challenging one. During questions, I'll go in a little bit more to some of our work in post-conflict settings, but I just want to leave sort of one final point to give an example of a structural change that's happening in our lives right now and think about how we might seize this moment. COVID has been a structural change in all of our lives, certainly far more felt in low-income households and low-income countries and among women. 1.7 times of the job loss that the world has experienced, we believe has been women's job loss. If there is any silver lining to it, it is the data that we're looking at from the UN Women's COVID Gender Response Survey across 47 countries, where between 35 and 80% of women said their male partner is doing more of some kind of hands-on care work than he did before COVID started. Now, women are doing even more. We started at an uneven situation where women were doing on average 3 times the amount of care work. As we look at women's reports of time, they are doing even more. But we do have to look at, it's almost as if we have enforced paternity leave for men in many parts of the world, that men are at home and doing more hands-on work than they were doing before. This together with the spike in men's violence against women. So it's not, I don't want it all to present this as a unmitigated positive thing that's going on. But I do think it tells us what do we need as we rebuild after COVID to acknowledge the kinds of structural supports to really change what happens at the household level. How can we involve men's, both preventing violence and men's care work, using some of the levers we have in social protection policies? How do we think genuinely about national care policies that look at the care infrastructure that households need, and particularly women need, that incentivize men to do our share of the care work? How do we look at the importance of media campaigns and how much our children in particular are spending online to promote healthy binary breaking ideas about gender as well? And finally, because we had International Women's Day yesterday, the US government announced a gender equality council with a pretty comprehensive policy. We need male politicians caring about and voting for gender equality and care policies and GBV prevention policies more than simply showing up for a couple of minutes and saying they're champions. So I want to end on that, try to be a little, provoke where we go next. And in the questions, we'll be glad to talk more about some of our work in post-conflict settings.
Thank you so much, Gary, for those fantastic remarks. You've given us so much to think about as we progress with this workshop. So thank you. I'd now like to turn it over to Laxman Belbase for his opening remarks.
Sure. Thank you, Sandra and Gary. I think where I would start off is to sort of make the connections with what already I don't want to be repeating, but also make the connections with the agenda of women, peace, and security. I think when it comes to the work around engaging boys and men in the context of women, peace, and security, the whole conversation, as if men weren't there, became a primary questioning or the primary start of point, which is something we should start thinking about. When you look at the peace, security issues or international relations, men were always there. And the engaging boys and men came with this assumption that we need to engage more men in this conversation, which was a wrong and a false assumption to start with. So I think in the women, peace, and security agenda, that's something we need to keep in mind at the first space, to really bring in and make the connections with the conversation and discourses of gender and power relationships in those spaces, and start engaging to look at the systems change that is needed when we talk about women, peace, and security agenda. But also, when we talk about women, peace, and security agenda, we also need to make sure that we mean actually the feminist peace. We are not trying to reinforce the same security system, the same militarized processes on looking at peace. and sort of very dominant global north-driven understanding of peace in the different contexts we work in. And that's somewhere I think the Women, Peace and Security Agenda 1325 really comes in and becomes a very important pillar to look at, is that it brings this systemic change at the center and starts questioning and following in protocols of the 1325 agenda to really bring to the question of the element of importance on looking at systems change in the way feminist movement have been understanding and looking at peace and security agenda. So I think also in conjunction with the masculinities piece, and when we talk about engaging boys and men, the gendering process of men throughout the life cycle, starting from an early age, and how boys and men get their relationship or understand their relationship vis-a-vis the weapons of different forms. Maybe it's small arms, maybe it's big arms, maybe it's nuclear weapons and so on. And the whole discourse that you see between the nations, that you look at the security sector, or look at Security Council resolution, Security Council as a space, the discourses are highly, highly masculine. So when whoever is looking into these spaces, it's important that we interrogate some of these notions and the way these spaces are created and the way those men are socialized because of what they understand it means to be a man. And also, again, building onto that, what it means to be a militarized masculine men to meet these standards that are set in the women, peace, and security space is extremely important. And also in relation to the international security and foreign policy arena, we will have to make those connections vis-a-vis how the policy formulations are negotiated. If you look at the Security Council resolution, Security Council as a space, UN Security Council, we see the discourse, analyze the discourses. They are highly militarized and highly masculine. And I think the way these relationships among men who happen to dominate these policy spaces and international relations spaces are men who have not really, or most of them have not gone through the understanding of the feminist movement, peace and security from that angle, but also what it means to be looking at it from a gender perspective. So I think when we look at working with men in power positions, it's not only about engaging men who are in power positions, but engaging them as individuals who are gendered beings and help them realize how gender gets connected with whatever they do, the kind of performance they do, right? If you talk about from a Butlerian language, the performative sense that comes into these spaces when men present, men engage with these conditions, the kind of sidelining of women's voices in these spaces. So that's one element to really think about and be critically looking into when we talk about women, peace, and security. Another one that also came out after the women, peace, and security was the inclusion of women in women, peace, and security. And some of the initial work started looking at just counting numbers of how many women are in the table, right? There is a sort of justification to look at ensuring that women are in the table, but also that needs to move into from relational to structural, looking at how sensitive and welcoming are these spaces to these women's voices. Are they being considered in the formulation of new policy agendas, in the international relations agendas that come out? And also then I'll stop as well. The last point is to look at the women, peace, and security, as Sandra also said, gender is very, very contextual. There is no single solution that works in the US context will work in my context in Nepal, where I come from. These solutions will have to come from a very contextual understanding of how gender power relations work, the intersectional analysis of the different variables that come into interplay in defining peace and security agendas, and how and their relationships with the nation state building process, which are again highly masculinized, right? So how do we bring those different interconnections and make sure that when we do and think about women, peace, and security, it's not about global north driven analysis that always works. We need to work with women in the ground And we are currently implementing with Women WILF a project on countering militarized masculinities. And we are realizing more and more that the solutions to these issues of peace and security needs to come from the local women's group who have been doing this work for decades. There is so much of knowledge, and hence we need to sort of apply the decolonial approach to knowledge building and understanding as well in these spaces. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Laxman. Those were wonderful opening remarks. I'd like to turn it over to my co-facilitator, Shagun, who's going to push us into the panel segment of our workshop today.
Great, thank you, Nick, and thank you to all of the panelists today for your really excellent opening remarks. Just a reminder that our participants can pose questions to the panelists at any point. For ease of facilitating, just mention which panelist you'd like to pose a question to. And if it's to all three, you can mention that as well. So I'd like to start by asking a question to all three of you. The phrase engaging men and boys is becoming more and more in use, but there are many debates as to how it should be framed and implemented. I'd like to open by asking all of you what your vision of success is when trying to engage men and boys, and how can this success be measured to make sure such programs are effective? Dr. Whitworth, why don't we start with you?
Ouch, I was looking forward to a couple of minutes to think about this. And I had been thinking about it, and I thought, well, this is, you're opening with such a tough question, because I think, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I have an answer to this, and I have, we were given an opportunity to see some of the questions that might come at us, and I have been thinking about it, and I thought, I'm not sure I have an answer to this. I'm not quite sure how to measure when we will know we have included men and boys as much as is possible. Because in the same way that I talked at the beginning, I don't think gender is not fixed, social relations change, and how this manifests itself in different times and places will also change. I mean, will I be more satisfied if I see greater activity of men and boys in these different types of spaces? Yes. Will I think that's it and we're done? No. I almost don't think there's an end point here, because I think it will always have to be re-envisioned and reimagined as conditions change and shift. Can I stop there and see what Gary and Laxman have to say, and then maybe I'll come back if I get, you know, the light bulb answer on this one.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, Gary, we can take some comments from you on this now.
I guess at the most obvious, simplest levels, I mean, I think the engaging men work needs to be held up against what key women's rights partners have advocated for at the national level. So again, if our North Star is, do women's lives, are we able to measure material changes in women's lives? And let's take violence and care work as two of those things that we measure and say, can we see that violence has reduced in a setting as a result of the approaches? And I think the engaging men work needs to not be seen as its own set of, projects, programs, or policies, but integrated into what a country should do at the national level to have a full integrated platform to end violence against women, which we are talking about, the vast majority of it, to end men's violence against women. And the same around care work. We gather data on time use. We ask women and men across with time use surveys, how much you do, of which kinds of tasks, are we getting closer to equal? We've got some apparatus that already exist. I think I agree very much with Laxman's point. It's not as if men have been missing from that. In fact, the violence we've been measuring is men's violence. The lack of time used to care work has been men's lack of participation in that care work. So I think we need to acknowledge Feminist researchers, feminist activists have been holding countries accountable to using indicators like that in our, if we look back to the Sustainable Development Goals, there are great indicators that speak to what men do. And I think those are a fantastic starting point. And then to say, are we being bold enough to have a vision to say, what does it look like at the national level that we can measure a reduction in men's violence against women? It must go far beyond a small scale collection of programs that are called Engaging Men. And the same with care work. And I would say active allyship, that, perhaps the third tripod for me would be men's active, measurable, demonstrable allyship around women's leadership and voice. And that would be, at the political level, from national to provincial to local. Would probably, if you made me with a policymaker have to define three, those would probably be my three. And I think if that's our North Star, it makes us go into any setting analyzing in a relational way, as Sandra said very clearly, that we look in the context and in a relational way, men's position on this and the plurality of men, women's position on this and the plurality and issues of diversity in there. So I think I think if we go in with that, with a framework like that, that says we're not inventing this, we are building on the tremendous work of decades of feminist activists who have put out national frameworks on how to do this. I think that's where we orient the Engaging Men work, and to say what it looks like and what effectiveness is.
Great. So what I'm hearing is we're not really reinventing the wheel. We're moving with what's already been set as a precedent by activists in the past. Laxman, do you agree with this view?
I fully agree on that, but also I think I agree with Sandra. It's a brilliant question. Anyone would be happy to start with getting some answers. But for me, I think one of the biggest success is everyone in the room who start thinking differently on this topic and starts thinking, dismantling the current system that is in order on thinking and working on this topic on in itself is a big success. I think, then I think in looking at the very structural level on what a success looks like is a quite a long, probably a process that we have to make sure we really understand what success means in a different way than the very international development paradigm that we have been oriented to as of now. But I think, at the broader level also, what some of the feminist activists have started looking into when looking at success, especially on the women, peace and security agenda, is how to look at the allocations of the nation's budget, on how much of money is now moved away from, supporting the militaristic, sort of development in their own countries. And there is a campaign launched by a couple of years back by Will Fund Move the Money, right? So the point is, the money that is going to support military, even a small portion of it, if it goes to issue of social security and women's rights, it brings a much more effective result in looking at addressing the issues of security and peace. So some have also started looking at from that lens as well, in terms of looking at the national or international level indicators, but also from a gender point of view and engaging boys and men. I think, I agree with Gary on looking at, how many men have started thinking differently and relating ourselves to the female in our own lives, but also how many of us have really moved beyond looking gender as binary piece, but rather anticipate and adhere to gender as fluid, as Sandra was saying. It's a spectrum, and it's always sort of in relation to the other, and the way femininity could be understood in the US context could be very different than the way it is understood in Nepal. And whatever is considered masculine in Nepal could be still considered as feminine in US context. So how do we if we can sort of make it more complex in a way that it is understood, or the way simplified version is currently in place in the international development sector, That would be one, but I don't think I have any indicators as such in terms of how do we really measure. These are very qualitative measures that we can affirm right now. But in that arena, yeah, looking at some of the aspirations of 1325 could be a way to look at, but also there certain discourses have evolved, really looking at some of these indicators on the success. But yeah, the biggest success would be if we, each one of us, can start questioning the systems that are around us.
That's fantastic. I'd like to take one of the audience questions that have been posed to us. Are there any success stories in working or training with UN peacekeeping troops globally in reducing or mitigating the hypermasculinity of deployed personnel? Perhaps Gary or Laxman or even Sandra, if there's any success stories that you're aware of that you'd like to share from the context that you're aware of. Gary.
I'll share a challenge, not a success story. We have had some success in working with militaries and with ex-combatants, both some work in Afghanistan together with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and in the DRC, in Eastern DRC, working with the DRC military, using a trauma-informed model that includes both group therapy, I think we can call it, that engages men at the community level, and then when it's with military and with police, it's group of police and group of military. About a third of the men in the group have not reported having used violence against female partners or other forms of violence in the household. Deliberately choose men who are seen as coping well, together with the other 2/3 of the men who have typically had some experience of use of violence against a female partner. And very much trying to build on positive coping. And there's separate groups for female partners and women, some of whom are partners of the men, some who are not. And then there's accountability sessions at the beginning and the end of the cycle of the men's workshops, where men listen to their female partners talk about their take on whether the change process has had an impact. The DRC military has asked us to expand those across South and North Kivu. When I say us, this is the Living Peace Institute, which is a Congolese organization that we help support, but it's its own organization led by Congolese. We've done some training with MONUSCO troops, but I acknowledge that it's really difficult to get beyond the way that peacekeeping troops work is that each group is led by its country troops. And it's really tough to get beyond sort of a one-off training. Most of the time in our conversations, the UN will basically say, well, we'll warn them if they carry out any inappropriate behavior, they'll get sent back to their country and they no longer get the stipend and all the rest they get for being a UN peacekeeper. It's been really tough to get the individual countries to open up their spaces and let our partner organization, LPI, to let it have access to doing training. There's some certainly well-intentioned individuals, but the nature of how peacekeeping troops are coordinated means that it tends to be very crisis response. There were a couple of incidents in DRC where troops from some countries were found, and we actually saw this in one of the studies we carried out, where they had been paying for sex with underage girls. There's often a kind of an immediate crisis response, but there's a lot of difficulty of getting that apparatus at the country level to open up, to allow us to do the kind of, or allow any organization to do the kind of meaningful training that needs to take place. I do believe there's a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of attention on the issue, but the mechanics of doing it well, it feels like there's a huge amount of resistance. I'd be curious whether Sandra and Laxman have some examples in those regards as well.
I was just going to comment on another element, and I think the kind of work Gary's just mentioned is so important. Working in a substantive way with peacekeepers who are deployed, but also noting the challenges of that. I'm a sort of pessimistic person on a lot of these questions, and I mean, a simple measure and a simple goal of 1325 was increasing the representation of women on peacekeeping operations. And I am not currently conducting research on any specific peacekeeping missions, but I read, I follow the announcements by the UN about the progress they've made. And they have been saying the same thing for over 20 years. Not much success yet. The goals, the benchmark dates keep being pushed forward. Now, I happen to not think that just adding women into peacekeeping missions will change their highly militarized structure. I'm not saying that, but it is a simple way to measure what's happening. And even on that simple measure, there is very little success or movement. The numbers of, 13 under 20% still on police personnel or military personnel. And you can check the annual, there's usually an annual statement on this. So I am struck by the way in which this conversation, even at that level, and again, I don't think that's the be all and end all answer to highly militarized peacekeeping missions, but as a simple add women and stir strategy, even that is put off and put off and put off. And I'm struck that the numbers, I'd have to sit and look carefully, but they don't appear to shift very much over the years. And anytime I look in on whatever the most recent announcement, hasn't changed much. So I'm interested when I hear what Gary's talking about, the work on the ground that he's doing and going in and talking to military personnel, talking to their partners, talking about what's happening. But it is challenging, as he said, and there's other ways in which I'm not seeing a lot of movement.
Great. So I will, just to sort of reflect on what's been said, I'm hearing a lot about how there's an element of accountability that needs to come in, which hasn't really happened so far. And I'll allow Nick to sort of take on that now.
Sure. No, Shagun, thank you for bringing that up. And I think this is a great kind of overarching question for us to move into next. We've talked about what is a vision of success in engaging men and boys. And we've heard comments on you have to integrate the impact on women and the changes in women's lives into your goals. But there is this idea of accountability, which is it's a very important point of conversation when we talk about engaging men and boys programming. And that's because often this work of gender equality, there have been women-led movements and activists that have been doing this for generations. And then you can have men who decide to maybe co-opt the pursuit of gender equality, and they get all the applause. And then the very important programs that got this issue to the table are kind of sidelined. And we have a very diverse, group of panelists here. We have an academic and we have a practitioner community. And so I'd love to ask, when we talk about accountability, how can that accountability to women when engaging men and boys be institutionalized in concepts and programming? And in a more detailed kind of practical matter, how can it be measured? This is something that we really want to kind of break down, incorporate into how we approach this topic. So I would like to hand it over to Laxman maybe to first answer this question.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think in the space on engaging boys and men, or the work on transforming masculinities, the accountability is something that has become extremely important. Rightfully for many reasons, but I think in this space, for not only for women, peace and security, but in general, the gender equality space, the accountability becomes a very important piece. The reason being, the work with boys and men on in itself, when it began, was not something that we men and boys suddenly realized we are gendered beings and we need to interrogate ourselves and the kind of power and privilege we enjoy because of patriarchy. It was women's movement that really started helping boys and men to realize we are gendered beings and it has implications on our own life, and most importantly and disproportionately among people around us who identify as differently than the way, the historical gender binary identities. So one is about the importance of us, of those who are thinking of this work, to be humble about that. The theorizing of gender also evolves from the feminist theorizing, and I think, and we need to build on to that. And I think our base on and in itself needs to be coming from that. So if we are then to work around transforming and looking at the gender equality and social justice element, we have to interrogate the power and privilege that we men carry, sort of structurally. Maybe at an individual and interpersonal level, we may experience the power relations differently. But again, if you bring it to the structural level, the patriarchy still is the highly dominant operating model through which those who identify men and boys or are related with men and boys do get a lot of privilege. And we need to sort of look at it from a complex, and that's where the accountability comes in, is the framework that helps to unpack that is the feminist lens, to really unpack the gender power dynamics and bring into the questioning. So if we are then not bringing and doing that in a way that feminist, if vision for equality has been doing it, we may end up, sort of reinforcing the same patriarchal paradigm. We have started having conversation around, what David Durasmith calls a good men project, right? In the women, peace and security, is then, are we then working to produce good men who would be there and do nothing to dismantle the system, which is patriarchy, and then still get applauded, as you said, Nick, on being in spaces and talking about gender, right? So how is that what we talk is translated into our own actions at all levels? And how is it that whatever we talk outside also relates to this personal is political agenda that feminist movement brought forward? And how do we make sure that whatever we think around the work with boys and men is informed by this feminist critique? We are not only looking at men as vulnerable individuals because of gender dynamics. Yes, that's one part of it. But the broader context where those vulnerabilities also operate is the vulnerabilities that it creates for those who are disprivileged or underprivileged or oppressed because of the patriarchal system that boys and men uphold in many ways. Maybe it at family level, maybe it at institution or community level or religion or whichever context you bring in. So I think, and then looking at on how do we then really measure accountability and success is something we are starting. But I think few indicators that we have identified is how many of the programs that are working with boys and men are done in partnership and under the leadership of feminist women's rights organizations. How many women's rights leaders are involved in designing, implementing, and evaluating the outcomes of the program? Or are we just self-doing it and then saying, oh, we have done amazing work, whereas nowhere in the picture we are involving feminist critique, feminist analysis, and feminist leaders to really say that. And one thing is also, as Gary said in the beginning, to also make sure when we develop indicators, we keep the end goal in mind and make sure we build a triangulation approach in our evaluation development process. And also looking at whether are these approaches and the R, Sandra, is the reintegration part of the DDR component, is it challenging the stereotypical gender norms? Because in the DDR process and approaches, including Rwanda, one thing that we really observed was the reintegration approach was not deconstructing social gender norms of what it means to be a man, and hence it was actually negatively implicating the lives of women and children in their families. So I think relating to all these pieces is extremely important, and also at the policy space. So I'll stop there. I think I already took quite a lot of time. And yeah, if Gary and Sandra would like to come in.
Thank you, Lashman. That was a wonderful, terrific answer. I think you touched on the importance of positioning feminism, feminist movements, feminist ideas, and feminist communities really as the key stakeholder in engaging men and boys. Now, I'd like to, if it's okay, just kind of extend this question to you, Dr. Barker, as well. And I'd love to explore a bit also You've talked about, the images survey, which is a very, intense empirical initiative looking at the positions of men and women on gender equality. And you've talked about, the importance of how men understand childcare and involvement at the home. I'd love to explore first how you see this accountability to women should be, put into indicators and studied. But also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how these views of gender equality in the home, the mechanisms behind how they connect to women, peace, and security. Because we know that with gender equality, what happens in the home, what happens in the family, is what happens in conflict between states and inside of states. So if that's okay, I'd love to hear just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, where to go on that one? I do think, or maybe I'll end on that one, but I'll start at a slightly different point. I mean, I think the accountability issue, is kind of, I don't know if I can describe it, but I know what it looks like when I see it. And I think one of the things that we try to, build into our organization and all of our initiatives is not just to say we care about accountability, but what is it concretely that we're doing? Every time we carry out the images survey in a country, there's a technical advisory board created that includes key feminist researchers and key women's rights organizations. They will look at the questionnaire, how we're carrying it out, who the partners are for carrying it out. So to make the accountability real in practice, our board of directors, our staff is half men, half women, and we try to include diversity as well. So that we make the decision making, and certainly the MenEngage steering committee and board is also divided along similar lines to say, put it into practice with real decision making, not just window dressing in any of the efforts to do the engaging men work. The other boards of directors of the Promundo affiliated organizations have similar makeups in their board of key women's rights leaders together with male allies who are part of it. So I think one is, have you actually built it into who makes decisions at what happens in your organization? I gave some examples of how we measure impact so that yes, we listen to men about how they change their attitudes or change their behaviors, but we give a stronger vote, if you want to call it that, to what women said. Have women reported that their male partners in the context of a heterosexual household have changed in those ways? And I think the same applies to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Not just to ask a few men, are you at the table, but to ask the women in the settings we're working on, whether it's women involved in negotiations or whether involved in programming happening in post-conflict settings, have you seen changes in men as women in the context of your households? Have you, as a woman at the table negotiating with government X and the UN, have you perceived a change in men who are at the table there? Takes me to a third point. I think this applies to the WPS field as well, is the importance, and Laxman, you touched on this, of men educating ourselves on the history of feminist thought in the space, to acknowledge where this field came from. We need to know about this as men. There's a kind of basic literacy, to call it that I think men who want to be male allies should have. The same with trying to be a white ally for racial justice in the US. You need to read a certain amount, to listen to voices, to be very humble and be willing to sit in the back of the room, to have a sense of where this field came from. We need those voices there, but not instead of. Are you listening before you kind of step in? And fifth, and I think this is, perhaps gets to the issue of indicators in the WPS field, which is to say, accountability is both messy and it's relational. What do I mean by that? I mean, I think the relational part, I think often we have, there's an accountability that says you didn't live up to allyship, so we invite you out the room. You didn't follow the things that we need here, so you're not at the table anymore. It really is tough to say, I want to disagree, but you're not allowed out of the room. We've got to figure out a way that we work on this together. How that we kind of walk in with a degree of, I don't know what I want to call it, grace and generosity, acknowledgement of the agency and the other, that we're able to really not just call out, but call in to say, we've got to figure out a solution here, as long as it takes us to do it. And that's where I think the messy part is. I mean, I think accountability is a bit like democracy in its messiness. It's long, it's slow. It's as messy at the kitchen table as it is at a peace negotiation table of what does equality look like in a relationship that's, in the context of a heterosexual relationship or a same-sex couple relationship. I think that level of messiness we have to acknowledge both at the the political level as well as at the personal level. So I think its success is measured by that. Do those who came into that situation with less power, do they perceive that something has changed? I would say that's where I would ask. If you ask me for an indicator, I would say that's the indicator that I would start with.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to pose one of our audience questions to Dr. Whitworth. What are the best efforts for the US to engage more women in a post-pandemic world? We've been talking a lot about accountability to women specifically, and there's been a drop in their workforce and their involvement in the workforce over the past year. Are there any ways we can make society more gender inclusive going forward, given our current moment?
Well, I'm not at all opposed to very explicit affirmative action practices and policies that either governments or institutions or workplaces can adopt. They are sometimes controversial. I think that controversy is unwarranted. It's backlash. It doesn't really reflect real concerns. And I think there's ways in which in this post-ban, I mean, we have mechanisms that have been used in the past. We have now seen a real backward shift because of the pandemic. And it may seem like a simple answer, but I think very explicit attention to what has happened to the workforce, wherever one's workforce is, to pay attention and to begin to return to, aggressive, explicit affirmative action policies. Places that I've seen where it works, and it can be adjusted to address the variety of unrepresented groups, again, in particular workplaces, whether government or non-government settings. So it might sound like a kind of a simple response, but I do think we've had a period in the past over the last 30, 40 years where we've seen these kinds of efforts before. And I think the main thing is, and from the questioner, recognizing that this is a moment that has pushed us backwards in a variety of ways. Women of color, in the US, I mean, the push out of workplaces has been significant, but there are mechanisms that can be used, and you just have to be willing to weather the extent to which it is seen as controversial by some groups.
Right. And what about the sort of sources of accountability for men of different groups? You talked a bit about accountability to women, but there's also queer men, cis men, trans men, and their identities relate to masculinity as well. So perhaps, Laxman, you can sort of start us off by speaking a little bit to how we can craft some sort of more localized solutions to encouraging these communities of men to also engage, and how that can be brought about.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that was exactly the point was coming to my mind as well. To sort of make this conversation more complex is that the challenge also that we face often in these conversations is to consider men as homogeneous groups, which is not. Men is extremely diverse, as it is for women and people who don't identify as male or female. So I think when we talk about accountability, the most important element that needs to be at the center is whatever we are doing or sort of carrying out in terms of our efforts, is it eventually contributing to ensuring the human rights and dignity of people who are at the margins of the margin? So I think one crucial element is to look at sort of the diversity among men. And then when we talk about boys and men or work with boys and men, we need to be very clear on which men are we talking about or which boys are we talking about, and consider looking at uh, or broadening our lens on the way we understand men to include men and boys in all their diversities as well, such as trans men, for example, right? So I think if we are to really embed accountability, we have to make sure that our systems reflect that, as Gary was saying. But also the challenge with that is what Sandra was referring, is what we saw because of COVID was the reinforcement of the same notion of producer or provider to men was highly significant in the US context as well as it was in many parts of around the world. And I think until our efforts are really pushing that understanding out of the window, we will again come back to the same paradigm, because whenever in the name of crisis or anything, what often happens is again everyone is put back into the boxes which have been there for centuries, and that feels very comfortable to many people, right? But I think the accountability conversation is those men and boys who are in this area of work, doing this work, are we raising our voice to push back against the kind of pushback we are experiencing these days in this conversation? And I think those pushback also needs to be informed on what is the need and interest of those who are at the margins of the margin. And we need to then create spaces for leadership of those people who are at the margins of the margin, so that their voices can be amplified rather than we speaking for them. It should be we speaking with them. So the whole philosophy of power with becomes the primary mobilizing element in the work we do. So I think based on that is also where accountability becomes an important element, to make sure that we look into the diversity and bring the population which has been in the margins of the margin. And in the US context, you can identify based on your own context of the African American population, the indigenous population, the gender non-conforming individuals, gay rights movement, and so on. So how do and bringing that, but also make sure that we don't revolve only looking at men as one box and then ignore women or female identified out of the box at the same time. So it's not only about looking at men in isolation, but really bringing what Sandra and Gary also brought forward, is this relational and structural elements together. And it's not about vice versa. Should I work on relational concept or structural? All should go in hand. And that's where, again, the transformation, what we call it gender transformative approaches, needs to be really transforming the unequal systems that have been in place. And that's where the accountability with diversity comes in.
Great, thank you so much. Gary, I briefly want to turn to you. You mentioned how this entire conversation is, and the identities and accountability involved is messy and relational. And I want to briefly pose this question to you in the context of sort of the cultural and regional expertise that you bring in, having worked with member organizations from several countries and individuals from several different nationalities. How does the conversation of engaging men and boys from these different cohorts relate across contexts?
I mean, I think the Promundo started as a global South-based and informed organization. I'm a co-founder of it with Brazilian colleagues, many of us who came out of a deep appreciation and somewhat schooled in Paulo Freire's approach to collective consciousness raising. And I think that that approach around breaking the hierarchy between those who supposedly have the knowledge and those who receive the knowledge has shaped a lot of how we do what we do. And hence our rather eclectic mix of country partners that share that approach, that awareness and breaking that kind of global North hegemony idea that we somehow bring responses and we're here to help is not the way that Promundo was created. And so I think I hope between the different partners that we promote a healthy question truth, question the paradigms, flip them around, learn from south to north. I'm thrilled that some of the approaches that are now supported by the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institute for Health in the US came from DRC and from Brazil and are being implemented in the US, paid for by the the federal government, a better use of US taxpayer monies than much of what goes to our military, I feel safe in saying. And I think it's also taking an approach that, kind of we've been talking a lot about the plurality, and I think Laxman just said very eloquently of kind of looking at masculinities in that plurality, including the pluralities of power and privilege. And so, I think what we've tried to bring as well is maybe something that defines how Promundo, a Promundo way of doing things is to break out of this frozen pictures idea that Sandra also said very well of, that gendered relations and masculinities are fluid. And so much, even our descriptions of men are, and we fill in the blank in setting X, we so much kind of make them rigid. And I think what we've tried to look in our research and our programming is the capacity of individuals and groups to resist. Women have, done it for centuries, and there's a lot of men who have, figured out ways that we can also resist the ways that hegemonic masculinities try to construct our lives. And that's not just I try to resist at the household, and question my father-in-law who says a man can't do this. But it means that we, how can we resist the power structures and systems that create these inequalities? And so I think focusing on ways that we can resist, focusing on pluralities, not assuming a global North hegemony, and I think going in with that question, how are masculinities shaped in this particular context? And where can we find both ways that it's stuck, but also ways that there's resistance and plurality happening all around us? That's easy to say in like a 2-minute. Putting it into practice, of course, is where it gets messy and longer term. But I hope that gives it a sense of, I hope our philosophy as an organization has come from.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was a fantastic answer. Yes. Dr.
Well, I just wanted to on the accountability question, I've been both really struck and heartened by the way in which you framed asking the accountability question and also the answers that were, looking about accountability to feminist activists, looking at accountability to the variety of men who may have been excluded from the privileges that often get attributed to them, holding and owning. But I guess one of my cautionary notes on this is the ways in which any of us with any activist commitments on these questions will also confront the wall of accountability that Laxman was talking about in his opening remarks in places and spaces like the UN. So an organization committed to working with men and boys, like your capacity to really think about who you're accountable to and what your goals are. I wonder about the freedom of many of the students who come out of your program when they go into these organizations and confront the extent to which the hand, can literally be put up. The accountability is not to feminists or to trans men or marginalized men. It is, to the Security Council, and it is to a Secretary General that is, as Laxman pointed out, highly masculine, highly militarized, and I know from the experience, and again, this is a while ago now, but the experience of doing that Women, Peace and Security document for the UN, the number of times we were told, look, how can you make my work life easier? And I need to know the 6 steps to be able to tell everyone I mainstream gender, but and sometimes legitimately saying we are dealing with massive conflict. There is an urgency to the questions we face, and if you can't fit into our box, we have no time for you, and we can't even listen to you. So there's that accountability. I think of my students are regularly huge critics of gender mainstreaming. And I always say, but what are you going to do when you feel thrilled to have a job in Canada, it's Global Affairs Canada, you're thrilled to have your job and you get told you're gender mainstream. How are you going to navigate that? And I think that's another thing here, that and even an organization like the UN, like I'm not talking about a defense department, I'm talking are highly militarized, highly masculine spaces. And, you know, I don't want to, don't give a hoot about accountability to feminists or to marginalized men. And I think that's a question, developing skills, which I don't know that I particularly have. I mean, one of the things I felt lucky about was I have, as an academic, I don't always have to navigate those spaces. I can speak from outside and try to, you know, draw ideas or create space for other questions. But many of our students will be in those spaces, and how do we help them navigate those spaces, I guess, in terms of the questions of accountability they will confront, which will be quite different than the ones I am delighted that we've been talking about here.
Thank you, Sandra. No, this cautionary thinking is very important in this issue area. So we have 11 minutes left, and I'd like to close out with kind of an activity. So of course, as you can tell by the Zoom background, this event is convened by the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace, and Security. And a core mission of our consortium is having academia fill some critical gaps in these issues relating to gender equality. And so I'd like to pose a final question and closing activity to each of our panelists. So this is a two-pronged question. First, I'd like to ask you, how can we bridge the gap between practitioner expertise and research that specifically targets the issue of engaging men and boys into the women, peace, and security agenda globally? And in that regard, how can students in the consortium turn the discussion that we've had today into policy research and actionable change that can assist you as experts in this field with your work? And this can draw on the specific case studies that we've discussed and the specific manifestations of all these issues we've talked about. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laxman to begin.
Yes. So again, wish we would have a sweeping wand here with the answers. But something that I can think of is, I think, for also building on to the question that Sandra, you started with, one of the key things to start bridging the gap between academia and activists is actually to bring them together. Is the way the knowledge is developed has been very boxed in academic sense and not really connected with the activism, the real groundwork that have happened. So within the knowledge building system and process right now, there is a greater realization of that. Those who are studying in these areas need to understand and go in that, observe in the field itself. So I think, and that on in itself also, so I think what I'm saying is, those who would like to understand more and do more research in the academic sector, you know, one best way is to then connect with the NGO sector who are doing this work in the ground and go in the field and see whatever they are learning in the theory, how that then gets applied in the real life. I think that exposure to the students on in itself becomes a very important piece also for those colleagues who are doing this theoretical understanding, have an understanding from a practical point of view, because sometimes, you know, the question, for example, how do I engage with UN system when I go in with my intersectional feminist analysis, whatever I have been taught in the academia, is also then to understand how these spaces work. And I think for UN, for example, one of the examples where, you know, those who would like to be more involved in UN system is the UN is founded on the human rights principles. So accountability is from a human rights framework. So my engagement with the Department of Safety and Security, the training I did for them on men and masculinities and gender parity, I used UN's own framework towards human rights agenda as the basis to say and articulate the question on the importance of they need to be gender sensitive and integrate. So I think having those exposures on how these international frameworks can be applied in the practical areas, And also there needs to be more and more spaces like this created where the people who are in the academia sector and activist sector can come together and have conversation. And the knowledge development should revolve around not only looking at the books and texts and interpretations, but really what are people telling in the ground, as Gary was saying, going to the area, what women are saying on the particular topic is how do we facilitate that is something. And I think for me, the what you all can also contribute is in actually collecting the knowledge that are out there in the activist area. We as activists have not been very good in documenting the or the or documenting the theorizing of change we are observing in the field. So the academia can actually help us in sort of come and document those the theorizing and theorize the changes we are observing and what that mean for the broader scale, either we call it scaling in or scaling up work that we intend to do as activists, and relate with that with the policy formulation and what we call evidence-based advocacy, is that that will all actually be extremely meaningful contribution from or based on what your interests are. So yeah, I'll stop there. And
Thank you. That was terrific. Gary, I'd love to turn it over to you now.
Well, first I can just say all that Laxman said. So I'll go on a couple of very concrete ideas. I mean, let's be honest about the challenges of the U.S. university system. It's very expensive. Who's able to get in and who's able to go? As a parent of a child who's now doing their master's degree, I'm very clear of what these cost in the U.S. I think we have to challenge ourselves as academic institutions to offer the training that we do for those who are not necessarily in degree programs. Some great examples, again, from the Global South of doing this. Much of Latin America has the diplomado experience where they are required as public and private universities to do a number of courses where they give a certificate to individuals who aren't enrolled in a degree program. Or, I mean, we might call that some of the continuing education credits that are offered in the US, but I think it's slightly more egalitarian than some of our continuing education processes. Our partner organization in DRC does that as well. There is no therapy training institute in Goma in North Kivu, for example. And so bringing in some academics, both from Congo, but also from outside of Congo, they've offered the equivalent of a certificate course in trauma therapy and in post-conflict work. So I think ways to, can you break some of your bureaucracy in terms of what's considered the degrees that matter? And I think that's something that, and that's where those of us who are, doing this as practitioners, as well as activists, as well as researchers could contribute, but that, your professors would have a huge amount to offer. And the other is, I think we could join hands in sort of trying to break, having had a foot in academia at a couple of moments in my career, there's often a stuck in a publish or perish process. And we're stuck in the NGO world in a, do your next project of the week or perish in very short-term funding. And you got to go on to the next one. If you've got to say with, a 6-month project that you've been able to overcome the patriarchy. And you've got to prove in, your next peer-reviewed journal that you've written the definitive piece of work in your field. I think we could work together on talking about, how can we break a bit that kind of short-term production measure that we're held accountable for, almost as if we were selling widgets or selling products at Walmart. I think we could do some joint efforts on saying, can we look to the longer-term structural political change that we're after, and maybe learn together on how to break those short-term paradigms that we're stuck in. And third, I think, and Laxman said this, it's finding opportunities we can do it together. We've benefited hugely from capstone projects, from interns. It gets real when we do it together, beyond the importance of a seminar like this, but we're always open to more ideas for capstone kind of projects and others. So consider our door open. I'm guessing MenEngage, is open to the same.
Thank you so much, Gary. That's fantastic. Something a big takeaway from you and Laxman's remarks is the importance of democratizing the knowledge-making process, which is what we really strive towards at the consortium. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Whitworth for her concluding remarks.
I those, it's hard to follow those remarks. They're both fantastic. So as Gary said, as Laxman said, and as you said, Nick, I mean, I think democratizing this process, I think also we will all inevitably be inhabiting different spaces. And part of what I was trying to say in my remarks immediately prior, I work in a pretty critically oriented department. Many of my colleagues would view the people I met at the UN when I was working on that Women, Peace and Security document as the sellouts, you know, that they're just working for the institution. And I think that we are all working in different spaces with different levels of freedom and also with different constraints. And I like the idea of the working together, because I think respecting what those constraints are. I did not, much as I was often being policed by people in that institution about what we could or could not say, that what was or was not acceptable. Militarized masculinity, for example, being one that we absolutely could not say. It would not, the document would not be acceptable to the UN. 20 years later, Laxman is in there doing workshops and trainings on masculinities, and I'm betting you drop the word militarized masculinities into parts of that, those encounters. So I think using our different, both the ways we have space to say things and interact, and not, I get worried when I look at my colleagues who are dismissive of those who work in these institutions. And again, I come from a department where unless you're a purist, you know, you're not. And I think we're all making choices, and we all have constraints, and we all have freedoms, and we each use them to push these agendas forward for that larger accountability question you were raising earlier, around social justice, equity, and the work that feminists and other activists who have come before us have been carving out. And in terms of, you know, again, the two prior speakers have said everything about the kind of interesting work that could be done. And I think each of us, again, working together, if in separate spaces, to keep pushing this forward, is exactly the way we have to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandra. So I will wrap us up. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. This has been such a fantastic discussion. I do just want to say, I'm just going to repeat myself what I said during the opening remark. This is the launch event of the consortium. This is the beginning. And the reason that we are holding these policy workshops is to eventually hold and create policy papers that correspond with the topic of each workshop that we can produce to help you all in your work in this field. So there is much more to come from the consortium in terms of publishing this material, and we are so grateful for the wonderful contributions and ideas that you all shared for it. I am going to drop into the chat just the links for our social media handles so you can follow and stay up to date on the latest developments with us. I will also note that Laxman dropped in the chat a fact that MenEngage, so Laxman and I helped teach a course last semester in masculinities and international affairs at the George Washington University. It was a fantastic course, and they are trying to incorporate internships as part of the experience. So professionally, there is much to explore with the relationships that come from this consortium. Just also one last thing to flag, that the closing session of our all-day launch event will take place at 5 p.m. today. And we will be joined by keynote participants, Ambassador Milan Verveer of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, as well as Dr. Chantal Dejean-Udrat, President of Women in International Security. We are so excited. So you can still register for the Eventbrite page to receive those links. But I think that wraps us up. So thank you everybody for attending. Have a wonderful day. Happy spring. It's like 70 degrees here in Washington, D.C., which is pretty nice. And again, thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you to Shagun for facilitating with me. Fantastic job, everybody.